And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to the largest, fastest growing, and the most active meetup and global community called Large Scale Scrum. I'm Gene Gandel, your humble host. Today we have a very special guest who is not, it's not his first time with our community, and we will be looking forward for his future talks. But let me just say a few words about the speaker. This is well-known Dave Snowden. Dave is the co-creator of Signer Finna framework, and he's also very well known in the world for the framework and its human and global impact. Dave is also the lead author of Managing Complexity and Chaos in the Times of Crisis. His work is international in nature and covers government, industry, looking at complex issues relating to strategy and organizational decision making. Dave has pioneered a science-based approach to organizations drawing on anthropology, neuroscience, and complex adaptive system theory. He also holds positions at some extraordinary places. He's the professor at the Universities of Pretoria, Stellenbosch, as well as visiting professor at the University of Hull. Dave also has held similar positions at Bangor University, Hong Kong Polytech University, Canberra University, and other universities around the globe. He's also the author of many papers and articles for which he has been widely recognized and received multiple awards. Dave is an editorial board member of several academic and practitioner journals in the field of knowledge management. So with that, and without any further ado, I would like to pass the baton over to Dave, and he has another provocative and very engaging topic today. So Dave, thank you for being here once again. Please take it away. I think you mute Dave, so you want to unmute yourself. Oh, I'll unmute you. Dave, you're still mute.
Okay.
And now you're
So
good.
how long do you want me to go for?
Now you're good.
Yeah, how long do you want me to go for?
We have an hour. If you would like to stay for a
Okay.
little longer, that's totally fine. Maybe manage the
I
time
won't
again.
use the full hour. I think we're a lot better if we get into dialogue. So I'll sort of do an initial provocation, right?
Yes.
Um, for those of you who don't know my background, my first degree is physics and philosophy as a joint major. That gives me a physicist's despair of social science. They never have enough data to form any valid conclusion as far as I'm concerned, and I haven't changed my mind since I was 18 on that subject. And I also suffer the Socrates problem in that philosophers are trained to ask different, please don't do that to me. Yeah, I want to see people.
You're right.
So I basically have the philosopher's problem of, you like asking questions even if people are upset by it, but eventually the people of Athens vote to have you commit suicide. And I've been that a couple of times in the agile community over the years. Yeah. I then worked on the program to combat racism and other things for the World Council of Churches. I was one of the first Catholic employees back in the 70s. That brought me into indigenous knowledge communities in Latin America and Africa and also Australasia, which profoundly changed me at a young age, if I'm honest about it. And then went through a sort of, what you do with a degree in theoretical physics and philosophy and 3 years of charity, you end up in HR. Because I had international experience and I was cheap. So that's how I got my first job in industry. Migrated in the early days of computing to be deputy financial director responsible for computing across the company. You could do that in those days. And the nice thing about being in finance is you get to know when the company's going bankrupt. So myself and the financial director left, and I chose not to be his deputy the next time around. I decided to go on my own. And that was the early days of building decision support systems. The first ever major commercial computer program I wrote was to take a telex machine output and digitize it to go into a financial recording system. So that shows you my age, right? And I, built the decision support systems for people like Guinness PLC and Maersk Shipping. And one of the reasons I could do that is I knew what they were doing. I'd done their job and I also knew computing. And I still remember the first time I met Guinness, I walked out of the room and I said to my boss, they don't know what they want. They're asking for something which won't help them. I know what they need. And he said, do what the client asks for and stop causing trouble. And I went away that night and said, to hell with it. And I wrote what I thought they wanted, not what they'd asked for. And it worked really well. Yeah, that got me promoted and all sorts of things. So risks are part of that. And then I moved into a strategy role within the company. We're a services company and created a thing called the Genus program. And this is where it starts to come into agile. We were one of the first pioneers in the use of rapid application development and joint application design workshops. That was a major theme of what we did, and we combined that with legacy system management and object orientation, which was a program which repurposed us. And as part of that, I came to a conclusion, and I remember having a chat in a pub in Cheltenham that myself, Ed Holt, and my equivalent in Logica and data sciences were deadly competitors. Well, so we all get together in a pub in Cheltenham, and over a meal, we agreed to set up the DSDM consortium, which, if you know your agile history, was one of the three inputs into agile, along with Scrum, yeah, and with XP. We didn't need a ski resort for a week. We just needed a meal in a good British pub in an evening, but that's a different level of pragmatism. But critically, we created DSDM between competitors. Yeah, it was done between competitors. It wasn't done for proprietary purpose. And I can talk about this later if you want, but the work we're doing with Hexi, the work we've done with the Scrum with Scrum Inc., is to actually start to bring competitors together in a single environment. So we have multi-methods, multi-tools, multi-vendors. Yeah. And I can talk about that later if you want. That's kind of like my background, all right? 20 years ago, IBM bought us actually 28 years ago. So I didn't volunteer for IBM. I was conscripted. It wasn't my choice. And I survived for 7 years before I started to, shall we say, irritate the wrong people, and then left to create the Kinevin. Yeah, initially, I co-designed the Singapore government's risk system with Peter Schwartz as scenario planning frame. So that was kind of like gave the company its initial impetus. So that's kind of like the background, right? So, and that lucky generation who didn't know about IT until we were in our teenage and then picked it up as we went along and learnt it through in its early stages of evolution. So that's my background in that sense. And for the last 20 years, I've actually built a software company without investment and without loans, which I'm still quite proud of. That's actually not easy to do, you know, in terms of the way you work. So that's the background. Yeah? Now, coming on to the subject today, which is meant to be about AI, yeah, and that sort of area. One of the things that I learned as I went through that process is people don't work in logical, structured ways. I remember when I was building decision support systems, as I say, for Guinness and Maersk, we were in the early days of AI, and there was a big debate between Prolog and Smalltalk. And I know I shouldn't have done this, but I fell into the Prolog camp. All right. And we started to build systems to actually replace doctors, and they didn't work. And there were two pathways that happened after that. One group said, if we just had better algorithms and more data, we could do it. And the other group of us said, hang on a minute, there's something going on here that we don't fully understand. It may not be possible. Right? And that's kind of like informed things ever since. Either way, when I left data sciences, I got an IBM. I got a real chance to get into the cognitive neuroscience. Complexity science came along. We'd seen knowledge management, and interestingly, agile followed the same pathway as knowledge management. It became a management fad too quickly for its own good. Had too many certification schemes and too many conferences. And after about 10 years, everybody realized that it wasn't making any difference anyway. So everybody involved in knowledge management got laid off. And one of the fundamental mistakes they made in early days knowledge management, and this is Nanaka's fault, and I've hit Nanaka twice in my career, once on knowledge management and once on Scrum. In both cases, he created a framework which claimed to be universal, which overstructured itself. Now, just to be clear on this, I think Scrum is one of the best collections of software development methods I've seen in my life, but it doesn't really handle complexity. It handles complex to complicated transitions, and it's a collection of methods. Sorry, it is not a framework. And it's a collection of methods which can be combined very effectively with other frameworks and with other method tools. So I'll debate that if they want later. So that's kind of like the background. But either way, the mistake KM made is to assume that knowledge doesn't exist until it's written down. Is the focus on tacit to explicit. And business process reengineering came along the same time, which then mutated into Six Sigma, or as Gary Klein calls it, Six Stigma, which I rather like, and I wish I'd invented that myself. And the focus is entirely on everything has to be explicit, everything has to be written down in a process. Knowledge doesn't exist and it's in text format. And I remember being at a conference with the CEO of Hewlett Packard in days when Hewlett Packard was a major. And he said, our knowledge walks out of the door every night. We have to codify it. And I remember saying, why don't you focus on getting it to walk back through the door the next day? It might be cheaper. And I would still stand by that. The trouble is that focus on text, you now see translate into LLMs. Right? And I refuse to call anything artificial intelligence. Intelligence is the wrong word. Yeah. And LLMs are not the totality of artificial intelligence. I've done a lot of work in my days to actually use genetic algorithms to choose between neural networks. So I'm not opposed to AI. I just understand how it works and how it doesn't. And anything which is doing probabilistic estimates based on text is very, very limited in terms of human cognitive capability. So let me throw a couple of things out. Yeah. The way we make decisions as human beings is we scan about less than 5% of the available data for most people that I can see pictures of. Yeah. Interesting, if you're Chinese, it doubles. We think the reason for that is the different language requirements. So people from a Chinese background tend to be more context focused, less object focused. Yeah, and kind of like vice versa. Yeah. But the most you're going to scan is 5% of data if you're really focused. You then match that against multiple patterns. Some of the patterns are your own memory. And by the way, there are chemicals in the brain which break up the patterns of memory. So you can never remember anything quite the same way it happened. And that turns out to be really important for evolution. And one of the problems with AI, it has perfect memory. And that's actually quite dangerous. There's no gradient. You take in other data. So for example, trust is largely determined by how people smell. Sensory data you don't get in a virtual environment. We know that women can restart the heart of their babies if the baby sleeps in the bed with them. We don't know the mechanism, but there's some sort of communication going on there we don't fully understand. We think it may be similar to what goes on with dowsing rods, which do work, but we don't know why they work. Yeah? Now, the point I'm trying to make is that there's far more to human sensory input than we even currently understand in biology, let alone what IT understands. And our ability to simulate that data very quickly is based on pattern matching. And we do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Yeah? So the basic concept is, you don't want to waste too much time making decisions. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to artistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on lions? Yeah, by that time, the only manual of any use to you will be the Book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I found of an escape manual from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on partial data scans taken in multiple sensory input. That is nothing remotely like the way the LLMs work. Okay? Also, art comes before language in human evolution. We think the evolutionary purpose of art, which develops to the heights of Wagner and Caravaggio, to display my personal prejudices, is what art does is it breaks us away from materials so we see things through an abductive lens. It's key to our innovative capability. Many people have really good ideas at concerts or looking at artworks. The liminal aspect of Knevin came when myself and my daughter were looking at Caravaggio's Seven Mercies in Naples, for example. So we think the role of art is to actually make us see things through abstract layers so we see unexpected and novel connections. At no stage are we making a probabilistic forecast based on our training data sets. Yeah, that's a really important thing to understand. Yeah? So humans don't make decisions in the same way as LLMs work, and doing autism faster doesn't make you intelligent. An LLM in human terms is deeply autistic. Right? I'm dyslexic. Right? I've worked with synesthesiacs. Neurodiversity in humans is huge and really important to our development as a species. Right? So that's kind of like point number one I want to make. Yeah, the human beings evolved to make decisions in very different ways from the way LLMs work. And if I want to put it really simply, we're not reliant on training data sets to deal with a problem. Yeah, things like metaphor, things like abstraction, things like fiction, human beings have developed all sorts of ways we can handle complete novelty without having to replicate what we know from the past. So that's lesson number one. Yeah. SenseMaker, which is our software, by the way, was originally developed in a DARPA contract. I was working for Admiral John Poindexter, who you may remember was Reagan's NSA. I didn't know who he was till I decided I liked him, and then it was too late. Welsh socialists are not meant to like former Republicans' NSA, but I do. And one of the big things we worked on then was that he had two big programs. One was TIR, which was an LLM equivalent at the time, algorithmic processing of huge volumes of data. And we had the human factors one, that was myself and SRI from Melo Park, on looking in human intelligence, how human beings make decisions and how you measure human sentiment. In military terms, it's called human terrain mapping, which is the program we ran both before and after 9/11. Now, one of the things which came out of both of those programs is that anything which is algorithmically based is actually quite limited. Yeah, it doesn't mean it isn't powerful. And to be honest, I quite like DeepSeek. All right, I use DeepSeek a lot. I can't stand ChatGPT. I never use it for primary narrative development because if I ask it to do something which is original, it gets it wrong or it finds the wrong material. Yeah. But on the other hand, if I feed it something I've written and say rewrite that for American management executives who normally are a reading age of 12, it's actually really good at that because it's got lots of training data to do that task. Yeah. So this concept of training data, non-training data is key. As I say, one of the functions of SenseMaker, which we'd like people to use it for more for, is to create epistemically balanced training data sets. And if you have epistemically balanced training data sets, you need much less data than if you're trying for a black box approach by scraping everything, and the energy requirements go down considerably. That's kind of like point number one I wanted to make, right? The other big danger on this is that there are things that AI can do better than humans, but if we don't do them for 10 or 12 years, we don't develop the capacity to determine whether AI is right or not. Yeah, human beings actually involve intelligence. It's not coded into them. Yeah, and it's not just your brain. Your brain is a decision maker of last resort. It only comes in a very small percentage of the time. Most of the time, your decisions are made by your social environment or by your body. The brain only comes in when there is an anomaly. And again, one of the uses of AI, and we've done it for this, is to throw up anomalies. So, for example, when we worked on child abuse, sorry, we get some, I'm currently working on end of life decisions for children. We get some depressing projects. Not quite as depressing as the week I spent scenario planning about the collapse of America in civil war, which I can tell you about. That was 15 years ago, which regrettably our backstory is coming true stage by stage at the moment. So I'm getting worried about that one. But sorry, I shouldn't go down these distractions. I lose track of where I'm going, right? So where was I going with that? It was a really important point and I've forgotten it now. It's late at night. Okay, I'll come back to that, or it'll come back to me in a minute, right?
You mentioned you're talking about end of life decision in children.
Yeah, okay. So what we're doing there, that's that. Thank you for that. Right? So if you're actually looking, it's actually a good example of where AI can be used for the benefit, all right? The same as we talked on child abuse, yeah? So an end of life decision for a child is really difficult because parents come into a hospital full of hope that their child will be cured. Then you move to this difference, and anybody who's I've lived through both my parents dying of cancer within 10 days of each other. And the day you're told that everything is palliative, not curative, everything changes. So for parents of a child in that circumstance, life gets more and more emotional. Doctors get more and more clinical. Yeah, because they have to immunize themselves from the emotional impact of what they're doing, and they lose the capacity to communicate. Now, we're doing a couple of things there. One is we're getting people to diarize in narrative form the whole of the patient journey pathway from a parent, a child, and a medical perspective. So we can build a narrative database which people can interrogate and listen to stories of people like them at different stages on their journey. And human beings understand things much better through stories. But then we can look at the patterns of use of those stories, and we can use them as training data sets for AI to basically create an early alert that doctors may be treating the parents badly, and that may create conflict downstream. Yeah, so what we're doing is we're using AI based on proper training data to say something may be happening here. We call that anticipatory alerts, or using AI to trigger humans to pay attention to something, but not to make the actual decision. Yeah, and I'm sort of being both positive and negative AI in that sort of context. Yeah. Now I could go on at this at more length, right? But we're actually running a big open research program, which we started earlier on this year in Brazil and Wales, which now goes into active mode in Vancouver in January, and will run for the whole of 2026. It's on our website. Feel free to look at it. The event in January is bringing together some heavyweight experts. Well, a brilliant cognitive neuroscientist I know, one of IBM's lead AI people, and me. All right, I'm there to make sure there's an argument, I think. Right. Last time we ran with it, everybody agreed with each other too much, so I'm there to make sure that doesn't happen. But what we're going to do is to look at several things. And there's some stuff people can do in the build up to this I'll talk about in a minute. We're looking to develop audit tools for a company to check whether their balance of abductive and inductive reasoning is okay. Now, to explain that, AI is inductive, humans are abductive. Yeah, in logic terms, human beings evolved to actually make unexpected, unconnected links between things which are apparently unconnected. Abduction is called the logic of hunches if you go back to the pragmatists. And we're really very good at that. Whereas AI is always inductive in nature because it's using past incidences to make statements about the future. So audit tool number one, which we partly defined, but we'll define in Vancouver, and then people will run it experimentally for the next 6 months, is have you got the balance between abductive and inductive reasoning capability right in your company based on the current context and the type of decisions you've made? The second thing we're going to be building on is continuous journaling, so we can identify what type of tasks that human beings are better than AI at, and there's a body of those, require humans to actually do routine tasks for extended periods of time before they develop their capacity. And if you look at apprentice models of learning, you'll see that happens. Yeah, the apprenticeship goes on for a long time. You become a journeyman, you become a master. So we want to do that and develop that as a framework. And we've also got 3 tools out now which people can play with, but then these will be refined through that research program. Yeah. One is to measure attitudes to AI within the company at the moment. That's something we developed with AstraZeneca. It's won several awards in the OD community. But you need to understand attitudes to AI at scale across your company before you implement it. Yeah. Or to correct issues when you're already implementing it in that way. The second thing we're doing is that there's a huge amount of people being laid off with AI being used as the excuse. I'm not sure it's really because they're replacing people with AI. It's kind of like in some cases a convenient excuse. But a lot of the executives I'm talking to, because we know the AI bubble will burst sometime early next year anyway, they're starting to worry about it. So we actually automate these tasks and then discover in 6 months' time it was a mistake. We shouldn't have automated them, but we've lost the staff who can perform the function. And that happened a lot in BPR days for people who were around then. Is people laid staff off and then discovered they knew things which weren't in the formal process. Outsourcing really brought that on big time. Sorry, I've been poacher and gamekeeper, yeah, on outsourcing deals. Yeah. So what we're looking at is, and this is just starting to run experimentally again with one of the big farmers, is getting everybody to say what their friends or they know and are capable of, which the company isn't using. What are your hobbies? What was your degree? What are your interests? And then we're creating a mechanism by which companies can find ways to use that untapped source of knowledge and capability for current business purposes. That's called an exaptive database. Yeah. And actually, that means the staff are still employed if the AI automation goes wrong. So that's been actually bringing up as a risk mitigation strategy. Yeah. So those are things that people who join the company can run, join the program can run in the build up to it, and the program itself will develop that. But it's all based on this fundamental principle which underlies the Cynefin framework. And Gene, you need to understand how to pronounce Cynefin. It's not Cynefin, it's Cynefin. Yeah. Welsh is phonetic. We just have a different alphabet from those bastards over the River Severn. Sorry, it's the rugby season, so we're getting quite worked up about this at the moment. Cynefin was always based on the principle that there was nothing wrong with BPR. We just made it universal. Okay? And that was my problem with Agile. There's nothing wrong with waterfall. Yeah, it's not universal. And I still remember working with Telstra in Australia, and they had massive waterfall projects for electricity, for telecoms infrastructure, but nobody got promoted if they weren't agile. So they created 1 year sprints so they could say they were agile. I loved that. That was Australian pragmatism. There's nothing wrong with time boxes. One of the key DSDM methods was a time box, and the way a time box works is you basically say, I've got a maximum delivery, a minimum delivery, a maximum resource, a minimum resource, and a team bids to deliver at least the minimum delivery for the maximum resource on a date. Sorry, I've managed multi-million-dollar projects in my lifetime. I'm less concerned with the function. I'm more considered I have a basic functionality on the date you promised it, because there are so many contingencies. And that's one of the reasons we develop time boxes for. Yeah, and if you achieve better than the minimum with less of the resource, then the team gets rewarded for that. Now, there's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't replace a sprint in Scrum with a time box. No reason whatsoever. And again, that's this sort of principle we call bounded applicability. Different things work in different contexts. And I'll sort of leave it with this key phrase: the way you scale a complex adaptive system. And I still remember the first time I ever saw SAFe, which was in Novi Sad, which is an interesting area if you come from the UK or the US, because it was one of the NATO war crimes. Yeah, during the Bosnian War was in Novi Sad. So you're speaking to people who were bombed by your jets within the last generation. So it sort of focuses you a little bit. And I saw the SAFe diagram go up in a presentation. I remember looking at it and asking a couple of questions. And I wrote a savage blog post called The Infantilization of Management, which still gets referenced from time to time, because I said anybody who knows anything about complexity knows that SAFe is fundamentally wrong, because it's trying to scale by aggregation and imitation. You scale a complex system by decomposition and recombination, or I like DNA. So to my mind, what it ended up with, the Agile ended up with a whole series of highly structured frameworks. And what we're now doing is say, let's break those down and allow them to recombine in novel connections. That's the sort of Hexi type approach. Yeah, so that's the science-based approach. So I've sort of ramped on a little bit about AI. I've talked about positive uses and negative uses. I've talked about positive and negative uses of Agile. Bounded applicability is a key concept. Context is king. Different things work in different contexts, in different combinations. And we need to stop doing this one-size-fits-all mass adoption, and the fad cycle in terms of the way we work. Okay, so I've rambled on for about half of the available time. Open to questions, open to arguments, very open to arguments. Arguments are fun. Yeah.
This is great. Thank you, folks. Out of respect to the speaker, to Dave, and just to keep it under control, raise your question, raise your hand, and Dave will pick.
Yeah, Mickey, you're first. They come up top left, so that's easy. Yeah.
So, I appreciate your sharing it, and that one size fits all is just so key and on the point. I was at a recent event where a person shared that we ourselves are actually an LLM.
Oh my God.
And as I listen to you, I'm hearing this. So going, you know where I'm going with this. It's like where, because You're like, what can we do? What should we do? What should the others, because of that dated knowledge? So there's it's not a contradiction. It's a, I don't know, it's a comparison, it's a difference. But just I brought that up to prompt something just from a discussion standpoint.
Yeah, I was doing a presentation the other day to the board of the European Central Bank, which is interesting. It's one of those presentations you have to prepare for because they're like serious shit people. And somebody asked me about AI, and I said, well, you have to realize that most of the algorithms have been written by misogynist males in their 30s on the west coast of the States who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which, as far as I'm concerned, is grounds for committal to a mental hospital. And I was, by the way, banned from Wikipedia from editing the Rand page for 3 months, but the Randinisters were banned for 3 years. So I thought that was a reasonable sacrifice, right? Part of the problem we got is that actually, and this is neurodiversity, all right? You need to be on the spectrum to be a really good programmer in these sort of fields, right? And that's the problem. So actually, LLMs think like a lot of the people writing them think, right? And that's an issue, right?
Yeah.
But we're more than that, yeah, at all stages. And also, the other key thing is we didn't evolve to be individual decision makers. That's a negative consequence of the Reformation. We evolved to make decisions in small groups and in clans and families and tribes. And we normally, this is role-based decision making, we normally actually spread decision making over several different roles. It's only the last 100 years we tried to make individuals primarily decision makers. Jeff?
Great, thank you. Let's just in the interest of time, Dave, if you don't mind, let's go in the order of how people have raised hands in the queue.
I
So
was. And Jeff put his hand up before Michael.
Jeff, yeah, Jeff is next.
Zoom works
Hello.
nicely. It basically puts people up in the queue at the top of your screen. It's nice and easy, right?
Yes.
Very
You go,
nice.
Jeff.
You made a statement that that really caught my attention. It's one I've been mulling over because of an event that's coming up. I'm meeting at a university symposium on AI and the job market and how students transitions. And I've got a big concern if a lot of this intellectual work can, entry level intellectual work can now be done by computer, and people develop through routine tasks that can now be automated. I mean, how in the world are students and new hires going to develop their skills?
And absolutely. But the other problem is we've been dumbing down education. So education has, because of targeting and everything else, education has become goal focused and it's become regurgitating text. And AI is better at that. Right? I mean, I think we're going to end up more with the oral tradition starts to come back in. The ability to orally defend a thesis rather than write the thesis is going to become more important, right? But the danger, I think, in AI and it is not that I made, well, it wasn't an error actually. I'll stand by it. I remember one conference on the West Coast years ago. I said the danger with AI is not that it will exceed us in intelligence, but we're reducing our intelligence to the point where it will outcompete us. And then I said, if anybody believes in the singularity, their brain has probably ossified to the point where for them it was possible. And I didn't know Ray Kurzweil was in the front row of the audience, but that's another debate, right? There was a big research program published recently about Bain Consultancy, which showed how much more productive they were with AI. It was run by serious academics. I remember taking one look at it and so that just shows how poor consultancy is. Anything AI can currently do better than humans, other than things like pharmaceutical research, where you've got known training data, if it's anything to do with people and attitudes, you probably shouldn't be doing it that way anyway. AI is much better at synthesizing text and appearing convincing than it is about doing original work. And the trouble is, consultancies become synthesizing text and appearing convincing. Yeah? So, yeah, completely agree with you on that. Michael?
Thank you. Michael next. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I want to two quick things and then my real question. The first quick thing is thank you, Admiral Poindexter, for giving us the term plausible deniability.
Yeah.
And he may be a nice guy, but we're seeing the results of him today. Second,
Just to correct on that, I know lots of very senior people in Washington, both blue and red. They're all nice guys. They're all evil.
I would not disagree with you, right? So I don't know if I say all, but I'd say most, but we'll see. You might be right.
Yeah,
I'm
sorry,
willing to
carry on.
concede that point. We used to define AI in the 70s as a class of solutions looking for a worthy class of problems, or that which is studied by the artificial intelligentsia.
Mm.
And I had that debate at MIT. So that would, that's just a little aside, but let me get to the main one. Um, yeah, scaled Agile and the certification mills and the consultancies killed Agile by selling what people buy. Now companies consider themselves either experts. We know Agile, we've mastered it, which they have not, or we tried Agile and it didn't work. But it's the case that actually does work. Agile actually does work if you do it. It's precisely because of complexity and a rational way to handle complexity. But the problem is how to message. How do you break through the noise to say, wait a second, what we were sold was Agile, what you thought was Agile, everything you know is wrong, in a way that doesn't put people off. So I don't know.
Naming things is always a mistake.
Yeah,
Uh,
and Agile shouldn't be a noun, but I kind of had to use it that
yeah.
way.
And I mean, let me give an example, all right? So one of the things is, my view on this is very simple. I'm primarily a methodologist. What I do is I take academic theory and I convert it into methods and tools. That's what excites me. Yeah, and I'm a good enough academic, I can have those debates, but I'm not motivated by academic papers. I want to create things that other people can use. Yeah. Now, one of the things once you start to get into the natural science is you start to say, actually, we need to respect the natural science in terms of the way human beings make decisions. And part of the problem we got is really since the 70s or 80s, people started to assume and they started to use the metaphor of a computer to describe a human. So, A, they anthropomorphize the computers. That's always a problem. And anthropomorphizing AI
Yeah,
is a major mistake. Secondly, they started to talk about, you're exceeding your bandwidth. Well, a human being can't exceed their bandwidth. We don't work like that. I mean, just to tell you, the brain of a bee has more computing capacity than Google Maps, and it's the size of a pinhead and uses hardly any energy. Yeah, so organic processing works in radically different ways from silicon algorithmic
sure.
processing. So I think the secret is to introduce new things. So one of the things we did when we wanted to make the point that Scrum is actually not a complexity technique, which it isn't. Yeah, it's in Cynefin terms, it's a liminal complex to complicated technique, and that's its
Yeah,
power. Take
and I
something,
teach it that way.
yeah. So what we did is we made it clear. So we created a new method of creating the backlog called entangled trios. And what you do with entangled trios is you put together a young, bright coder straight out of college together with an experienced and nearly always cynical systems architect. I've yet to meet a systems architect who wasn't deeply cynical because they've lived through life. And put them together with a user trained to talk to IT people. And it's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than it is to train IT people to talk to users. And then we would throw 15 of those trios at creating the backlog, which means they find things which a systems analyst would never find. But we also then create a social network between users and developers, which they can fall back on when the project runs. Now, that's me doing a both and process. And I'm saying Scrum works, it works here, but we need to do something first. So rather than say, throw it out and take all of our methods, you say, well, actually, that's quite useful. It works here. Let's put something else with it. And I think that's what we need to start to do. So it's like vibe programming, which I'm waiting for the first person to announce certification schemes in
We're
vibe.
doomed.
Yeah.
I'm
Um,
sorry, planes are going to fall out of the sky and bridges are going
yeah,
to collapse.
just don't take me there. Sorry, if you ever fly into Finland, I did the UX and the master plan on the Finnish air traffic management control system. And and for every critical bit of code, we had three teams working on three continents, not communicating to develop in parallel. But that was the only way to be absolutely safe. Yeah, and I
Sure.
still think that's a good approach. So I think the key thing is not to create a movement, not to give it a name, but to start to do lots of small things and let them make a difference. So that's what we're trying to do with Hexi, to be honest, is take everything which was in Agile, but break it down into smaller things, combine it with smaller things from other areas, and kind of like work on that.
Cool.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Michael. Thank you for your great question. Moving on, just for we getting some questions down here. Jim is next, then Tone, and then Matthias. Jim, you up?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think I agree with you on most things. I did want to talk a little bit about the creativity and whether or not humans and AI think similarly. So if we're talking about generative AI and not machine learning, when we're talking about unstructured data, the way these LLMs work is they read a lot of things and then they come up with probabilities, as you mentioned. So I like a bagel with, and then it assigns a probability to cream cheese, jelly, radishes, crickets. And it tries to most of the time find, depending on how you've weighted it and tuned it, a best fit answer, which is, as you said, is not necessarily the way humans work. But it's fairly similar because when we're children and as we grow, we've tried a bagel with cream cheese and jelly and probably not the crickets, but we've tried a lot of different things. So we've assigned weights and probabilities to the next word anyway. And then the real creativity part is the humans are great at juxtaposition. So if you say, I like bagels with cream cheese and I put it on a plate, well, it figured out and I put it on a plate via probabilities. But every so often, it'll go off because it's a neural net parallel processing. It'll come up with, and I eat it while I'm in the felt. And then
But
you've got a fairly creative statement, actually. You've got the bagel and cream cheese, which is rather pedestrian, but then you're eating it in the felt, which is a little bit creative and evocative. So between the fact that we learn kind of similarly with experience and value the next words in a sentence, and the fact that it juxtaposes just like we do, is it that radically different?
no, first of all, human beings don't assign weights and probabilities like AI does based on experience. It's not the way the human brain works. Yeah. A huge amount of our decision making is actually, to use Andy Clark's term, scaffolded into our social construct. A huge amount of our learning happens before we've even got language. All right. And brain plasticity up till 2 or 3 is radically different from what happens after that. A lot of your neocortex processing is done by your carer. So this computer metaphor is actually it's a misapprehension. It's not the way that human beings evolved to make decisions, right? And that's important to understand. Right? The other thing is, there's a big debate in the art movement, and sorry, I did philosophy and I loved aesthetics and ethics. So if somebody puts a pickled shark in the tank and says, I think that's art, so it's art, is that art or is it not? And the general view of anybody sensible on this, i.e., those of us who are right as opposed to the people who are fundamentally mistaken, is unless you've got the craft, it's not art. So Picasso can draw perfectly, but then he breaks the rules to create a new movement of art. So craft precedes art in that sense, right? Now, human beings, when they break the rules of, when somebody puts different tastes together, they're working in a completely different sense from a sort of empirical, experimental, weight-based feedback loop. They're using imagination. They're speculating about what could be, even if it's never been before. Fiction, all of these things we developed as species work in very different ways. Oh, and by the way, what you can write down is less than 5% of what you know.
Yes, yes.
And
And
that's
as you said,
really
our decision making is based always on very limited information
the
in a
body of
very quick
knowledge which
fashion.
LLMs have been trained on. And also, by the way, I think the estimate at the moment is 42% of LLM training data set is LLM output. And anybody who knows anything knows a model that feeds off its own output is going to get corrupt very fast. And that's what we are. Yeah.
Feedback loops are not usually very, very
Yeah.
helpful.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry, Dave, were you finishing up your answer?
Yeah.
I want to make sure that Dave's answer is by far is more extensive than anyone's question. So if you could try to make it very succinct, folks. Tony, you next. Just frame it so that we can all understand.
Sure. First of all, thank you for that opening. I found it very interesting. I want to get at this idea of inductive versus abductive reasoning, and relative to something that John Krakauer and Dave Krakauer and Melanie Mitchell have written about recently in a paper about the emergence of intelligence in LLMs. Do you think, Dave, that in the future, LLMs or whatever the next architecture would, in some sense, use hallucinations to bootstrap abductive reasoning? Because the argument that Krakauer would make is that we have to put a lot into LLMs to get a lot out. But what we do is we can put a little bit in and get a lot out. Could hallucinations get us there?
Well, I mean, the old adage, and there's a really good paper on this with this title, is LLMs bullshit, humans hallucinate.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah, so hallucination in humans is a form of imagination. It's really important to us, and we use metaphor. So if you look at abduction, there are kind of like three basic approaches to abduction, all of which are compatible with each other. One goes back to the pragmatists, and that's hypothesis generation. Now, to be honest, at that level, within certain confines, LLM is going to be able to do hypothesis generation, but we don't think that's really what it means. A lot of this goes back to one of the first splits between systems thinking and complexity science, which was the split between Bateson and Ashby in the Macy conferences. So Ashby was coming from a concept of information based on Shannon, which is kind of like data signal information.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Bateson was saying, well, look, what about metaphor? What about imagination? Because they can't be digitized in that way.
Right.
And that's still a fundamental divide. So systems thinking really always goes back to Ashby and Shannon, and AI always goes back to that concept of information. One of the fascinating things coming out of theoretical physics at the moment is the idea that information may be a fifth type of matter that we don't fully understand yet. And that's way beyond what can be represented in text. It would account for dark matter, by the way, if that is the case. Yeah. And it kind of like makes sense in some ways. You can see its application. So I think it comes back to the point you made earlier, the energy efficiency. Think what a human brain does on 4 megawatts compared with what an AI needs.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And why are we putting that money? I mean, all these big, electricity generators, and the good news is it's driving improved energy efficiency, but the bad news is they're going to be sitting around like the fiber optical cables sat around when that didn't take off. Yeah.
Right.
So it's problematic. So kind of like my view on is if human beings can do something, let them do it. And particularly when they do it in groups, you then got more resilience. And I'll throw out one other question. I mean, sorry, I sit on some very depressing think tanks. So sometime in the next 10 years, between 30 and 50 million people will die on one day of heat. The issue isn't now whether it will happen, but where and when. All right. And southern United States is one candidate, along with India. What's that going to do to human beings' response to it? But what's it going to do to the planet and to our energy grids? South Africa is having to manage without electricity supply for extended periods. That's going to happen in America and Europe as well. Yeah, human organic things are far more resilient under conditions of stress than basically machines.
Sure.
Thank you for
Thank
this
you very much.
answer.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for that, Tone. Thank you so much. Let's move on. We got 8 minutes, 7 minutes on the clock. Matthias, you next.
All right, I'll try to be quick. Thank you for all these really interesting, all this background. I love all the nuance that you bring to this conversation. One of the things that has been frustrating for me about a lot of the AI discussion is that I think that nuance is completely absent. I think it is actually what you were referring to earlier, that people aren't even processing this with their brains. They're processing it with their social context, fear of missing out, silver bullet thinking. A lot of this conversation is not about whether it's the right thing, it's what everybody else is doing. And I mean, even with Agile, that was true to a large extent. Do you have any thoughts on how can we work with people to actually spend the time to try to understand these things in a way where all this nuance starts mattering versus just following the hype cycle and ignoring most of the actual reality around it?
And one of the most effective things you could go and do is go out and destroy every golf course. Because all of the fads start with CEOs listening to somebody else on the golf course. So if we got rid of the golf courses, we'd stop that mechanism of communication and fad generation, right? Added to which I hate golf courses. There's too many of them on the long distance walks I do, right? I think the fad cycle, it didn't happen before the 80s. It came in the 80s with the adoption of systems thinking. So if you go back to scientific management, which many people in the agile criticize, and they've never read Taylor and they don't know what they're talking about, right? Scientific management worked off a military metaphor of leadership, and in military metaphors, sergeants outpoint generals in some contexts. Yeah, what scientific management was do was to humanize the workplace compared with what came before. And it didn't get rid of an apprentice model of leadership. What happened in the 80s when systems thinking comes along is we get into an engineering metaphor. And the problem is engineers don't like ambiguity. So everything has to be measured, everything has to be structured, no ambiguity is allowed. That's breaking quite catastrophically at the time, and we're now moving into an ecological metaphor. Yeah. So, for example, one of the things we're doing at the moment is we've been mimicking the swarming behavior of bees. So, if you look at bee swarms, they always find the best possible location of all the locations investigated, but they don't have a directed intelligence. It's based on micro interactions and micro disruption. So, we're now using AI to present problems to the whole of a workforce and then go through multiple iterations the same way that the bees go through iterations. But all of the decision nodes are humans distributed in a network rather than AI. So we're using AI on the connections and the reprocessing and the representation, but we're keeping the human agents in the network itself. And I think that's one of the things which is going to happen. People will get competitive advantage by not following the fad cycle and by doing things differently. And I think, these things come to an end, all right? The sort of obsession with structure, the obsession with fads, it was a phenomenon which arose in the 80s. It gave rise to the management consultants, and it gave rise to the business schools. They all came from that point. Right? And I think that is now dying. And AI, ironically, is probably going to destroy the big consultancies.
All right, let's hope. Thanks.
Let's hope, right? Thank you for that. Last question. Going to go see. We should time box it too.
All right, I'm boxing it and sharing the the affection, I guess, for the Caps. You were there. What
Those
would you add?
Starbucks city mugs, they go on around 2
This
walls. I've got one for every city I've been in.
awesome, yeah. What would you advise the younger generation as a mom of a junior in high school who's considering studying computer science and is telling me, well, will the
I've been
programmers
telling
still be
people,
needed if AI is going to take over the world?
well, first of all, AI won't take it over. I mean, the evidence at the moment is AI can program moderately competently on greenfield sites, but it's crap on brownfield sites because human beings can take the legacy code into account, right? But equally, I've been advising forever that people shouldn't do computer studies at universities. They should do anthropology or physics or biology or philosophy, something that gets them to understand human beings, because those skills will always be needed. And you can pick up programming later. I mean, there's a small number of people who need to do computer science at high depth, but it's not the volume you've got at the moment. And the irony at the moment, you're more likely to get employed as an anthropologist than you are as a business school graduate. Right. So, but the other thing I would also say is do what you're passionate about. Don't People keep making this mistake. They kind of like do what is fashionable at the time. The things which my parents told me there'd be no future if I did geology and physics. Right. Now, if I'd done geology and physics, I would have had a major future in an oil company, right, which is probably a bad thing. Right. So I did philosophy and theoretical physics to upset them. All right. But the fundamental is what the skills, people at junior high school at the moment, what skills they need, we have no idea. So do things you're passionate about. And the other thing is read everything. We need generalists, not specialists. And by the way, a T-shaped generalist is a nonsense. If you're a deep specialist in one area, you can't be a generalist. Yeah. So read everything, debate everything, be curious, get out, do things in the world, be politically active. Yeah. Just learn to interact with other human beings because those skills will always be important.
Thank you very much, Dave. Folks, on this note, we probably need to wrap up because we're out of time. I think I'm happy that the last point that Dave made was, let's go back to the basics. Let's not teach children computer science from day one. Let them get exposed to something that's much more natural and much more humane and human. So thank you for that. Dave, I want to personally thank you once again for making the time to come out and speak in a very humble way without a deck. just to give your wisdom back to us. So that's always a great thing. It definitely counts.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, guys.
The weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gene. as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.